When we are working with any web project, we first need a database, and that is the heart of the application. In this case also, we will have to add a database, and we will be doing that using SQL Server. But for database, I will be using Entity Framework Core code first, and in that we create a model, and based on that model, we create a database table. So first we will have to create a model in our project. So we will create a new folder, call it as model. Inside there, we will create our first class file, which will be category. Inside this class, we will have to create all the properties for all the columns that we want in the table. Let's say we want 3 columns. We want name of the category, we want a display order, and the last one will actually be the most important one. All the tables require a primary key. So we will be adding an ID column, which will be identity column in SQL Server. What I mean by that is when we create any record, we do not have to pass that ID. It will automatically increment by 1 every time a new record is created, and that will be unique. So for all the 3 columns, we will have to create 3 properties. The first one should be the primary key. So for that, we will type prop here, which is a snippet to create properties inside Visual Studio. So we type prop and we press tab 2 times. It creates an integer by default. That's fine. We want to call that as ID. The next property that we want is name of the category, which will be a string, and we will call that as name. The last one will be an integer of display order. So with this, we have created a class which will be our table in the database, and it will have 3 properties or 3 columns. Now before we magically create the table, we need to do some more configuration. Let's take a look at that in the next video. We will be using Entity Framework Core to create the table and populate details inside there. But when we create a table, we need to tell Entity Framework Core that this column will be an identity column and it will be a primary key. Let's say we also want to add a validation that this name should be a required and not null property inside database. So how can we add all of those validations and requirements? We have many attributes that are available to define all of the requirements, and all of them are defined inside data annotations. So before the property here, we can give that an attribute inside a square bracket. The attribute to make this column a primary key is key itself. You will have to press Ctrl dot here to add the using statement, and you will press enter. Now by default, if a property name is ID, Entity Framework Core automatically makes it a primary key. So this is optional. But if your name was something different, like let's say you wanted to make display order a primary key, then you will have to explicitly say that. But if it is an ID and if you have not defined any primary key, then it will automatically set that as a primary key. That is good to know, but I always like to explicitly define so that when someone opens up that model, they can directly say which one is the primary key. Next, we want name to be a required, and for that we have an attribute which is required. That will make sure that name is a required property when the SQL statement is created to actually create this category table, which we will see in the upcoming videos. Right now, things are pretty simple. We created a class file, it has few properties, and we added some easy-looking data annotations for our requirement. How will we actually create this table and database? That is the main question. For that, we will have to do some configuration, like adding a connection string to our SQL Server, adding some NuGet packages so that we can use Entity Framework Core and SQL Server with our project. Don't be overwhelmed. Let's get started by adding the connection string in the next video. In this video, we have to add connection string. So before we do that, let me open up SQL Server Management Studio. Here, the first thing that you require is a server name. Now, many times a dot will work for localhost, but if that does not work, you can try localDB, MS SQL localDB. Whichever server name works for you where you can connect, that is the one that you will use. I'm going to use just a dot because that is working and that's how I have configured SQL Server. I don't want the long one, so I'll just use the dot. Once you are able to connect here to SQL Server, we will go back to our project and we will add our connection string. Now where exactly will we add that connection string? All of the settings like secrets that you have in the application, you should add that inside appsettings.json. If you examine, we also have development here. So if you have more versions like production, staging, preview, for each one of them, we might have different settings. So you can add different settings inside the individual file, and based on the environment name, it will automatically use the correct settings. For our localhost, we will use appsettings.json. So inside appsettings.json, if you examine, we have some key value configuration. We have a block, inside that we have another block, and finally we have key value settings. When we are working with connection string, we can directly create a key value pair right here. But connection string is something that is common across all the application. That's why .NET Core team has provided a special block that you can use for connection strings if you want. Using that will make things a little simple, but if you want to go with a custom block, that will also work. You will just have to put some extra effort to retrieve the connection string. We will use the default connection string block that is provided with .NET Core, and that is connection strings. Once you press enter there, you will notice the curly brackets. This means it is a block. In there, we can write our connection string. You can give that any key name that you want. I'm going to call this default connection. And after a colon in the double quotes, you will write your connection string. The first parameter here will be the server name. You will write equal to, and then whatever server you are able to connect in SQL Server, copy that and write that here. I'm using a dot, so that is what I will use. Then we will add a semicolon and we will add the database name. You can call your database whatever you want. I'm going to use Abby. Finally, we will have the security, which is trusted connection is equal to true. That's all that we need for connection string. The trusted connection is because I'm using Windows authentication to connect to my SQL Server. So with that, we have added connection string in our project. But we need to configure our DB context so we can use this connection string and configure Entity Framework Core in our application. It might seem daunting in the beginning, but do not worry. Once we set everything up, it will all make sense. Let's continue in the next video. Now we have our connection string, we have our category model. How do we add this model to database? In order to do that, we will require Entity Framework Core in our project. So you will right-click on your project and you can select Manage NuGet Packages. Once you go there, we will have to install a package. Inside the browse, we will search for Entity Framework Core. We have the first package here, and I have enabled the include pre-release because right now .NET 6 is in preview. So we will install that package in our project. Now while we are here, I know we will be using SQL Server and that requires its own package as well. So make sure you search for SQL, and we have Microsoft.entityframeworkcore.sql server. Now when you install NuGet packages, if you are using the preview version or even if you are using the older version, always make sure that all the packages in a project must be of the same version. If you install one package in preview 7 and other in preview 6, it might not work. Or if you install one package in .NET 5 and other in .NET 6, it still might not work. So it has to be the same version, or else you might face issues later on. That being said, I will install both the NuGet packages so that we can add the configuration of Entity Framework Core in our project. Perfect, we will close the NuGet package manager, and now we need to create a DB context so that we can interact with Entity Framework Core for database. So inside the project, we will right-click, add a new folder for data. Inside there, we will have to create our class file for accessing the DB context. You can call this anything you want. I like to call that application DB context. Now this file will implement the DB context, or it will be like a data layer that will connect our application with the database. So it must implement the DB context class inside the Entity Framework Core. So we will add a colon here and we will write DB context. Now you will see the red squiggly lines because it does not find or does not know what is this DB context. If you press Ctrl dot here, you will see the using statement inside Microsoft.Entity Framework Core. And DB context is defined inside the Entity Framework Core to access and manage the database. When we are creating a DB context, we need to get the connection string as options. Then once you have configured this, inside this class, we will be creating DB set for all the tables that we want in our database. So the first table that we want is the category model that we created. So in order to create that table, you will have to create a DB set. So we will say public DB set. We will write the model name, which is category. You'll have to press Ctrl dot to add the using statement. And then here, whatever name you give will be the name of the actual database. I will call it the same category, and we will have getter and setter. So here, if you named it category 1, your table name will be category 1. So this is actually the name of the table that you want inside your database. Our application DB context looks good, but we need to do one thing. We have a DB context in our project, and we have connection string inside our appsettings.json. We need to configure this DB context to use our connection string. That way it will know how it can connect to the database. Let's see how we can do that in the next video. Now we need to add the connecting bridge between our DB context and connection string. So we need to tell our application that, hey, you need to use this application DB context to interact as a DB context, and you have to use the SQL Server with connection string that is inside appsettings.json. So all of that mapping will be done inside program.cs, where we are adding services to the container. The reason we are adding that as a service here is once we add it here, we can extract that and use it with dependency injection throughout the application. So we will be adding DB context as a service in our application. Now previously in .NET 5, all of this was done inside startup.cs class file. But starting with .NET 6, they have combined both startup and program.cs into one single file. So here we are adding all the services to the container, and then we are configuring the request pipeline. So now we no longer need multiple files. Everything is much cleaner. So in order to add service to our container, we will say builder.services, and the service that we want to add is DB context. So we want to configure the DB context, which expects a class name. So here we have to tell that which class in our application is implementing DB context. That is application DB context. Once you write that, you will press Ctrl dot to add the using statements for abbyweb.data. Then here we have to pass the options. So we'll say options here goes to, and we will say options dot we have use SQL Server inside the Entity Framework Core namespace. That way we are saying that for this DB context for database, we want to use SQL Server. And inside here, we have to give the connection string. Now how can we extract our connection string from appsettings.json? I said before that connection string is a special block that is given by the .NET Core team. So that's why they have given a special method to access all the key values inside that special block. You can do that by using builder.configuration. They have given a method getConnectionString that will look for a key name inside appsettings.json. So inside connection strings, what is the key name we should look for? We should look for a key with the name of default connection and we want its value. So we will copy default connection and paste that in the key name when we use getConnectionString. That will actually retrieve the connection string and configure our DB context. Now here you can see with application DB context, we are passing the options. So inside our class, where we have the application DB context, we should retrieve that options and pass that to the base class of DB context. So here we will have constructor using the snippet ctor tab. And with this class, we will receive DB context options on application DB context. We will call that as options. And all we want to do is pass that on to the base class of DB context. Pretty simple and straightforward. But this line of code is very critical. If you do not do that, your connection will not work. Now right now it might seem that we are doing lots of magic things with setting up application DB context, some code in program.cs, and we are retrieving our connection string from the app settings. But this is very basic connection that you have to do with all .NET Core applications when you want to use and configure Entity Framework Core. So this can be treated as basic steps that you should remember and memorize. But what we are doing inside program.cs, we are just adding items to the container so that we can extract and use with the help of dependency injection. As we proceed with the course, dependency injection will make much more sense and you will see how easy it is by adding things to dependency injection to extract when we want to use them. So with that basic configuration, we are almost there. Next thing we have to do is we just need to create our database. We have all the configuration that is ready. Let's see how we can accomplish that in the next video. That all the configuration is done, let's finally create our database. Let me switch back to SQL Server. And here, if you examine the database, we do not have any ABI database. So we have connection string and everything in place. In order to make connection with Entity Framework and actually create SQL, we will be adding migrations. What migrations will do is it will see that inside application DB context, we have a DB set on category, so it will write a script to actually generate SQL that will create this table. It is pretty fancy and everything is optimized. Let me show you how we can run migration first and then it will make sense. There are two commands that you should remember. In order to run migration, we will go to Tools, NuGet Package Manager, and Package Manager console. Inside here, we will have to write a command to actually create migration. And that command is add migration, and we have to give our migration a meaningful name. So we will call this add category to DB. That is what we are doing. We added just category inside our application DB context. So let me press enter and let me show you what error we get. We get the error the term add migration is not recognized. Now you remember we added NuGet packages of Entity Framework Core and SQL Server. One more NuGet package is needed for this. I want you to search this error and find out what is the NuGet package. Okay, I hope you were able to do that. If you just copy this, go to Google, paste that. The first one here, if you scroll down, there should be the package name right here. So these are small things that you will run into when you are developing, and you should always take Google as your first help station, because it is possible that someone else has faced this error and that will help you. So you will search for that NuGet package, make sure the version is same, and you will install that. Perfect, that is done. Let me close that. We will go to Package Manager console and run the same command one more time. This time it will create a new folder of migration in your Solution Explorer and load the migrations. Great, you can see a new migration have been created and there is a new folder with the name of migration. So let's analyze on what we are doing inside the migration. You can see we have an up method and a down method. Down method is basically rolling back the changes that we are doing if something fails. So let's ignore that. Inside the up method, we have migration builder, and we are saying that create a table with the name of category. In that table, we want columns. The first column will be ID column of type integer, nullable is false, and make sure that it is a SQL Server identity column. You can see with the key attribute, it is configuring everything for us. Then the next column name, it is saying that make sure that is not a nullable column. That is what we added as required. The last column is display order. That is also nullable false, but the reason behind that is it is of type integer. And then in the constraint, you can see we have a primary key on the ID column with the name of pk_category. So here you can see it is doing everything that we wanted. You won't be able to see the raw SQL that is being executed, but it is optimized. But in order to run this migration and see the table in database, we need to add one more command. So tools, NuGet package manager, console, and the command is update database. Let's press enter. What it does first is it will check at that connection string, does that database exist? If it does, then it will just push the migration that we added. If it does not, then it will create that database and then it will run the migration. So now the database should be created, and in there we will have two tables. We have our category table, which will have the three columns that we created. Perfect. And we have a table which keeps track of all the migrations that have been applied. So let's examine the EF migrations history, and you can see it has the migration ID, which is name of the migration that you can see here, and the product version. That way Entity Framework code knows that this migration has already been applied, so next time when you run the command update database, it will not reapply this migration. Pretty smart to track everything that is being done with Entity Framework. So great, with that our database has been created successfully. Let me close everything here and let's continue from the next video. Now we have our category table that has been created inside the database. So what we want to do is we want to create a new page where we can display all the categories. When we are working with Blazor pages, it will be inside the pages folder as compared to views in MVC. So inside pages, we have the home page, which is index.cshtml. We want to create pages for listing all the categories, creating category, editing category, and deleting category. Rather than cluttering everything in one place, we will create a new folder inside pages. I will name the folder as categories, and in there we will create a new Blazor page. The first page that we want to create will be used to display a list of all the categories, so we can name that as index. We will select the Blazor page empty here because we want to start with a clean and empty page rather than working with a template. So select empty and we will hit add button. Name of the Razor page, we will keep that as index.cshtml. Let's add that. As soon as you add that, you will notice two files were added. One is the CS file and we have the CS.html. The .cs file will be the file where we have page model for our index page. You can see the model that is being referenced here is inside Appy Web Pages, Categories Index Model, and this particular namespace will be the namespace that you see on top here. So that is how it is binding everything together, and we have our class index model. Now we used Entity Framework Core to add migrations to create our category table, which was inside model, and our DB context was application DB context. Inside program.cs, we registered that service in our container. Since we have registered this service, whenever we have to access database, we do not have to create a new object of application DB context. What happens here is the service is already available in the container. So we just need to tell our container that, hey, I need to use the DB context to access database, so give me an implementation of this class. How do you do that? That will be done using constructor inside the CS file. We need to create a read-only application DB context and we'll add the using statement. I will call that _DB. Now we want an implementation of this class using dependency injection. That will be done inside constructor. So we'll type ctor, press tab twice. This is a snippet to create constructor quickly in Visual Studio. Now if you have registered anything inside the container and you want its implementation, you simply tell here the implementation that you want. So we will write that we want an implementation of application DB context and give that to us in a variable with the name of DB. We will assign our private variable, which is _DB, the value of DB. So now our _DB will have an implementation that already connects to the database and we can use that. Inside the onGet method, we need to retrieve list of all the categories. In order to retrieve that, we need to create a property that will hold all the category list. So on top here, we can create an enumerable on category, and let's call that categories. Next thing that we have to do is we need to populate this categories list. So this we need to populate from the database. So we'll say _DB, and with Entity Framework Core, when you write dot here, it will display all of the tables or DB sets that we added. So if you scroll down here, you should see the category DB set that we added. So we want to retrieve _DB.categories. This will retrieve all the list of categories. We did not have to write any fancy SQL like select star from categories table. We did not have to open a connection. We did not have to close connection. No cleanup was needed. Entity Framework Core takes care of everything and we just access DB context, and then on category we have multiple methods to create, update, delete, and much more. But if you just say _DB.category, it will automatically retrieve all of the categories and store that in this variable. Our get method looks good inside the index page model for categories. Now what I want to do is inside shared, we have _layout. We can navigate to two pages. We have index and privacy. Rather than privacy, I want to navigate inside the categories folder. We have the index page. Since we want to go in folder, we will not use the /. We can directly say categories and then /. What is the page name? That is index. So here we have to use the exact route that we have in folder structure. If you were using MVC, you have controllers and action method. But with Razor pages, everything is simple. The actual way in which the folders are organized will be the exact route. So routing is pretty simple in Blazor pages. We will change the link here to display categories. And let me save this, run the application. Right now it is running things using the Abby web profile, but we will change that to IIS Express in just a second. But if we go back, we have the categories tab here, and you can see the URL in the bottom left. It displays the categories. Let's hit this button and see what happens. We see an index page here, but no data is displayed. We don't want to work with data right now. Let's go to our code behind here and let me add a debugging point. Let's go back and let me just refresh the page. We hit our breakpoint. If I press F10, it will take us to the next line. And then if we examine what got populated in our categories, it will be empty because we do not have any records. So it yielded no result. Let me add a breakpoint on this line, remove the one before, and let me switch to SQL Server. We can keep our application running. Actually, I can hit the continue button to go back. Inside SQL Server, let me expand the database, tables. Let's directly edit the top 200 rows. Let me create a name, test, and display order 2. So we have one record in our database now. If we go back to the application and hit categories one more time, it hits our breakpoint again. This time we should see one record that is being retrieved. And perfect, we see all the details populated. So with that, you can see we are successfully able to retrieve all of the records for categories from database. In the next video, let's work on displaying these categories inside the index page right here. Now that we have seen how to retrieve the categories inside the get handler, we need to actually display that in the Blazor page. So if we go back to index.cshtml, this is the index of categories and not of the main page. So inside the index of categories, we want to display all of the categories. If you have only worked with web forms and never worked with Blazor pages, inside Blazor pages you can have HTML code as well as C# code. So you can have if-else, you can create variables, assign them values, as well as HTML directly at one place. So let me add a div here, give it a class of container, and I will give it padding 3. These are just bootstrap classes to creating a container, and inside there we will create a row. So we will give it bootstrap class of row, padding top of 4. This will be one row on the complete screen. Now that one row we want to divide in two pieces. First, on the left hand side, I want to display a title. Since Bootstrap divides a row in 12 parts, if we want to divide those 12 parts into two pieces, for the left hand side we will have 6 pieces and right hand side we will have 6 pieces. So we will have div here, give it a class of column 6 to combine the first 6 pieces in one single element. Here we will display an h2 heading and we will give it a bootstrap class of text primary. We want to display here the heading, which is category list. That looks good. Here we will have the later part, which is div of class column 6. And we will add buttons inside this div later on. This looks good. Let me add some space, so 2 BR tags, and then we want to add a table to display our categories, so we will use a table tag. Inside this table, we will have a thead for header. Inside thead, we will have tr and th tags. This is just HTML tags that we are working with. Inside the first heading, we want to display the category name. And inside the next th, we want to display the display order. Now that is good for the heading. We want to have a body where we will be displaying the actual values. Now if we have 10 entries inside category, inside tbody, we will have a tr tag and td, just like we have th inside the heading. Here we want to display the actual value of category name. And then we will have another TD which will have value of display order. Now if we have 10 categories inside database, we want this tr to repeat 10 times because we want to display all the category name and display order. So if you were working with C#, you would be using for each loop. We will do the same right here. In order to use a C# code, we need the @ sign. And then we can just write for each statement. With for each, we need an object to iterate. So we will say variable obj in, and what we want to iterate on will be inside our index model. This index model represents what we have in the CS file. In order to show you, if you right click here, and if you click go to definition, it takes us here, and you can see in here we have the variable for categories. So we can access these categories. Since it is an IEnumerable, we will iterate through that. Because inside the get, we are already populating that categories, so we should be good. So back to the UI, we want to iterate over that IEnumerable of category. To access this model that we have right here inside the lowercase m, we will have to use a keyword which is model, but this time the m will be capital. So whatever we have inside the smaller case model here, anywhere inside the view or page, if you want to access that, you will use the capital M model. So if you press model dot, you can see all the models that are available inside the CS file. So we want to iterate over the model dot categories, and we will have a curly bracket here. So each categories inside the model dot categories will have a temporary name of obj. This is how for each works. So for each one of the object, we want to display a tr tag, and we want to display the values. To display value, we need to access the obj variable right here. So again, we will use the @ sign obj dot, and we will see all the properties that are available. We want to select name from there. The next one that we have is display order. So we can say obj dot display order. We will add some width on both the TD tags. With that in place, let me save this and run the application. If we go to our categories, we have the category list heading, and we have a table here, but I want to give it some bootstrap classes. So we can go back, and on the table tag right here, we can add class is equal to, I will add 3 bootstrap classes of table, table bordered, and table striped. Also, I will give it a style of width 100%. Now when we are making changes inside CSS or even anything inside the UI side of CS/HTML, once we save it, we can go back and actually refresh, and it should make those changes visible. But right now it is not working. We already added the Blazor runtime compilation for this particular package. But the reason that is not working is right now there is a bug, and you have to manually add a statement. So for that, we will have to go to program.cs, where it is adding the Blazor pages. You also have to add a command here, add Blazor runtime compilation. This should have been done automatically because we selected the Blazor pages, but I believe since .NET 6 is in preview, they will fix this down the road. But if this is not present, add that, and let's run the project one more time. If you go to categories now, you will see a nice table. With this, you can see how we are able to display all of the categories inside our Blazor page that we created. If you examine the URL here, it is only categories and not index, because index is there by default. If you write index manually and press enter, it will load the same page. Perfect. With that, let's continue in the next video. But before that, let me change the setting here to use IIS Express. That way we don't have the command prompt every time. Now our index page is working as expected for categories, and inside the CS file, we have the get handler. Before I proceed on the next task to create a category, let me switch back to database here and we will write a query. So select top 1000 and let me just delete the record. So we'll delete the category that was present and now there is no categories. And once we make that change, if we go back and run the application, perfect, everything is clean. Now I want to add a button here to create a category. We have not added that page right now, but we will do that. Let's go back to our index here and we left a space inside the right hand side of the category list. So we want an anchor tag. Now we want to go to a new page that we will create inside the categories folder with the name of create. So for that there are tag helpers. The tag helpers that we want to use here is ASP page. If you were working with MVC, then you will use action and controllers. But with Razor pages, everything will be ASP page. We want to navigate to a new page with the name of create. Since this is inside the same folder of categories, we do not have to explicitly mention here the categories before create page. It will understand that by default. So we want to go to a new page of create and we want to give it class of btn primary. Inside the anchor tag, we want to display create new category. Now the application is running and we enable the Razor runtime. So if you do F5, it should display the button. If you click here, nothing happens. This does not mean that your link is broken. Nothing is happening here because that page does not exist. If this was an MVC application, it will take you to a page not found, but with Razor pages, it is different. If the link is broken, it does not display a not found, it will just stay there. So in the next video, let's create the new Razor page to create a new category. Just like we added the index page to list all the categories, we need to add a new Razor page inside the categories folder to create category. So we will add new Razor page, empty, looks good. This time you have to call this as create. You can see here we are creating a Razor page and not a Razor view. Razor views are used in MVC application and they do not have a page model. We will create a Razor page and let's hit the add button. This time the model, you can see it is create model, and if you examine the .cs, you will see the class is create model. So that is how it links both of the file. Now right now we have the onGet handler. Inside the onGet handler of index, we were retrieving all of the categories to display inside the page. When we are creating a category, we do not have to populate any information. Inside the create page, we will just have an empty text box for user to enter the display order and name of the category, so that will be empty. Since we do not have to do anything inside the onGet, let's work on the view itself. Inside view, we will have a form in which user will enter name and display order and they will hit the submit button. So we will have a form tag here. This will be of method post. Then we will add some bootstrap classes. We will add a div, give it a class of border, padding 3, margin top of 4. Inside there, I will add another div, give it a class of row, and padding bottom of 2. And I will just add a heading h2 that will display create category and an HR for a horizontal line. After this div, I will add another div, give it a class of margin bottom 3. And in here, we want to display the label, which is name, and then we want an input field of type text. I will copy this and paste it one more time. Next property that I want is display order, and type will be text. Of course, in HTML, you remember we give that some name like display order. The first one here, we can give it a name of category name. After that, we will have a button of type submit. And we can give it some bootstrap classes of btn, btn primary, and a constant width of 150 pixels. Let's call this button as create. So perfect. Now we have a form to create our category. Let's run the project and take a look at that. So if we go on categories, and now if we select create new category, we see our new form. Let's continue with the form in the next video. Now in a typical web form, what happens is we have a name for this input field and display order. So when we post that, inside there we will try to extract that based on the name, and we will see what value was appended. But with Razor Pages, we have something special. We can bind this input text directly to a category model, and then we can use that model, or rather have those values available inside the post handler. So we will be binding this to a model. In order to bind a UI to a model, we have to create that property or model inside the model of the UI, which is create model, that is inside the cshtml.cs. So just like inside index, we created an IEnumerable of category, and then we binded that right here to extract using model.categories. We can do something similar inside create.cshtml. We do not want an IEnumerable, we just want one single category. So we will create a category property, and we can access this property inside our UI right here. Inside the index.cshtml, we saw the tag helper ASP page that is used to redirect. Similarly, we have a tag helper that binds a property, and that is ASP4. Here we have to write the name inside our model. To extract that, we will need the @ sign. We will say model dot, and that is inside category. Inside category, this is for name. And with that, we also do not have to define any type or name. Everything will be done automatically, and all the bindings will be done. We will just add some bootstrap classes for styling. Now this will create an input field. Similarly, we have something for label. So if we have a label here, and if we use ASP4, we can use @model here. But if you do not want to use the @model when you are using ASP4, it is smart enough to automatically bind the models. So you can directly say category if you want, and .name. That is pretty simple. But if you don't see that option, you can always use @model to access everything inside the model that is defined right here. So we are just adding a label here with the tag helper of category name. Let me copy these two lines and paste them for display order as well. We will just have to change the property name to display order. With that, let me save the changes, go back and refresh, and we see this error. Because we also modified the .cs file, we will actually have to rerun the project. If it was just the cshtml or the UI, then we do not have to rerun our project. So let's go to categories here, and if we hit create new categories, we have name and display order. Let me press F12 here and inspect the element. You can see on this element it automatically populates the ID and name, and you can see name is category.name. So it does all of the binding along with the type equals to text automatically. So you can see how life gets easy with tag helpers. Now once we enter any of the details here and we hit the submit button, we want to fetch those details inside the post handler. We only have a get handler right now. So let's add a post handler and continue from the next video. Now we need to create an onPost handler. By default, only get handlers are created. If you were working in an MVC environment, then you would create an onPost action method. But in Razor Pages, we create handlers. So creating handlers is simple. We will call public and then the return type. I want to make this an async method, so I will add async and task of iActionResult. iActionResult I'm using because I want to return to some page or redirect to a view. So that will be the return type, and we will call this onPost. Now when we have to name handlers, it will always start with the keyword on, and then we have the HTTP verb that this handler will do. This handler will support the post action method, so that's why we will call onPost handler. Now if you have multiple post handlers that you want in a Razor page, you can give this a handler name after the post. Like you can say onPost create, and then you can have onPost edit. That can be two post handlers. But right now we just want to create one post handler to fetch the details that user entered and create that category inside the database. So here on post we will receive a category object. Let me call that as category, and let's create that inside our database. In order to work with database, we need dependency injection with the application DB context. So first let me create an application DB context. We will do control dot for the using statement, and I will require a constructor. So ctor, and I will retrieve that from dependency injection and assign that to my local variable. Then we want to create the category that we received right here. So for that we will be using _db, and we have to define our model, which is category. On there we have more methods. We have methods to add, remove, update, and much more. The first thing that we want to do is add. Now you can use this add, but we have added the async method, so let's use the async implementation, add async. In there it expects a category entity that we have fetched with our onPost, so we will add that. Now when you are using async method, we will have to await that before we proceed further. When you write this one line, it is telling Entity Framework that hey, this is the category object that you have to add inside the category table. But it does not tell Entity Framework to go and do that right now. In order to tell that there is a different statement, we will say await _db dot we have save changes async. When you write the save changes async, at that time it gets all of the items that it has to change inside database and makes all of those changes. So if you forget to write save changes, it knows that it has to do that, but it will not save them to the database, and when it redirects or something, that will be lost. So always make sure to save the changes. Once the changes are saved, we want to return back to the index page. You see it displays redirect to action, but that is not valid in our application because we are using Razor pages. So with Razor pages, we have redirect to page, and we want to redirect to the index page. With that, let me save this, add a debugging point, and let me restart the application since we made changes to the code behind. Let's go to our categories here. We have create category. Let me enter test and the display order. Hit the create button. Now as soon as you do that, if you examine the category, you can see they are populated. Let's hit continue here. And great, that is created. So with this, we are able to create categories inside our application. But I want to show you one more thing. Let me close the application, and here we are fetching the category object and we are adding that. We already have a model here for category, so it is something that is redundant. To avoid that, .NET Core team has provided a special attribute which is bind property. When you use bind property, you no longer have to write it here. It automatically does the binding with the UI that we have on the screen, and that will be populated inside the same object. So then we can use this category and add that like this. This will make things much simpler. Let's run the application and try to create one more category. So let's create test 1 this time. And great, it is working as expected. Now this is not needed right now, but I'd like to show you something else. Let's say you had 3 properties that you are binding here and inside the post. In that case, you will have to write bind property on each one of them. From .NET Core 2.1, they have added a special property that you can apply directly at the class level. That is bind properties. What that will do is all the properties that you have here and you're using inside the UI, it will bind all of them automatically so that you do not have to individually add bind property. So with that, if we run the application, our create should still work the same way. Even though we just have one category, it's good to know that we have that option available if needed. Let's try to create a new category, test2 here. And great, it's working. So with this, our create functionality is working as expected. Let's add some styling here and continue from the next video. I want to change the themes that we are using in our application. So if we go to Google and if we search for bootswatch.com, this provides free themes for Bootstrap. If you scroll down, there are all the themes that are available. I will go with the Cyborg theme for this course. You can download the minified version or the bootstrap.css. Let me download the bootstrap.css. I will copy everything that we have open here. Let me minimize this and we'll stop the application. Let me add a new CSS right here. This will be style sheet. I will call this Bootswatch Cyborg. Let's add that and I will paste it here. Let me close this, and if you open site.css, they have added some different color for BT and primary. I will remove those two. That looks good. Now if we go to underscore layout, we can modify the bootstrap reference that we have here to the new CSS. So inside the CSS folder, we have Bootswatch Cyborg. Let me scroll down where we are using the Bootstrap.js bundle. Let's go back here to bootstrap.com and let's scroll down. We have the CDN for JS with Popper. Let me copy this and we will paste that right here. This will make sure that we are using the latest one for our course. Lastly, if I go back with Bootstrap, we also have icons that are available to use. You can see there are quite a few icons that we can use in our application. To get started, let's go to the Install tab, and we have the CDN that we can copy. Let me paste that with the style sheets. So perfect. With that, we'll be able to use icons that are available with Bootstrap. Now that the CSS is updated, let's run the project and see what happens with the new theme. Things will be a little different. Perfect. That looks good, but I want to change the navigation here to be dark as well. So if you go back and if you examine the theme details, you will notice we have a dark navigation. Let's use that. In order to do that, we will go back to underscore layout. Rather than navbar light, this will be navbar dark, and the BG will also be dark. Let's go back and refresh, and this looks much better. So you can see how easy it was to switch themes. Now I do not like the header and background both the same color, so if we go back to Bootswatch, let me find out some other theme. We can use this darkly theme, and you can see the navigation is a little gray. Let me switch that. I will download the bootstrap.css, cut everything here. Let's go back to the application. We can remove that and paste the new code. If we go back and refresh here, great, this looks much better. Let me remove the two borders here, and in underscore layout, we will search for border. We will remove the border bottom. We have one more right here, and perfect. Let's go back and refresh. Great, the UI looks good. Inside the footer, I will say BG dark to get the little gray shade. Great, this looks much better. The only thing that is missing is our headings here are in black, so we'll have to go back there and remove the text dark to give them the white color. Let me save this and refresh, and great. Now the create category looks much better. Let me also align this on the right hand side. So we will go to our index, and where we have the button here, we can give it the class of TextEnd with Bootstrap 5. Great. Now while we are here, let's also use the icons of Bootstrap. So inside the icons, if we go to the top, let me search for pencil. We have this pencil square. We can copy this, go back to the create new category. Before that, let me add the icon and a space. With that, you can see adding icons is super easy. So with that, the design looks good. Now what I want to do is inside create category, if you try to hit create button, you will run into an exception. It says the SQL exception cannot insert null values in name. That is because the column doesn't allow nulls. Our Entity Framework core was smart enough in migrations to add the not null based on the required property. But here we need validations so that we do not see this ugly exception. Let's do that in the next video. Now we want to add validations on the create window. If we go back to our project and if we examine our model category, you can see for name we added a required validation. So we want to make sure that this basic validations that we have defined here should be applied when a user is inputting those values. Checking for those validations is super easy with .NET Core. First, let's take a look at server-side validation. So that will be done inside the .cs file when a user is actually creating the category. We are using a model here to insert inside the database, so we have something known as model state. That model state will get the bindings and its state, and in there we have an isValid flag. This will check if the model state dictionary is valid or not. Model state dictionary will have a key value pair for each entity that is there in our model. So inside category, it will have whether the name is valid or the display name is valid or not, because we are entering both of them inside the create UI. So let's examine model state.isValid. If that is valid, only then we want to create. If that is not valid, we want to return back to the page. And that is how it should be. But let's add a debugging point here and let's examine what actually happens. Let me restart the application because we made a change inside the page model. So with that, let's go to categories and try to create an empty category. We do not hit our breakpoint. That is because the breakpoint will only be hit if the model state is valid. Let me add a debugging point right there and hit the create button. If you hover on model state, you can examine all of the properties in there. The isValid is set to false, which means the model state is not valid. Now why is it not valid? That you can examine by going to the result view. You can see there are two properties that it is monitoring and both of them are not valid. The name is not valid because it is a required field, and the display order is also not valid because it is an integer field. If you enter null in there, that is not valid as well. Let me hit continue here, and this time you don't see the ugly screen because if the model state is not valid, we are returning back to the page. This time let me enter name and then hit create. The model state will still be not valid because of our display order. This time the error count is 1, and if you expand the result view, you can see name property is now valid, but the display order is invalid. So with that, we can easily check our model state, and only if the model state is valid, then we create, else we return back to the view. But that is not helpful. We should display an error message saying what actually is invalid so that user can fix that. Doing that is super simple with .NET Core. If you go to create.cshtml, we have a special tag helper to display the validation errors. So right after the property or wherever you want to display, we will have to add a span tag, and there is a tag helper ASP validation for. Here we have to write the name of model property that we want to bind with this validation. We want to check for validation category.name. So if there are any errors with category.name, that will be displayed in the span right here. And we will also add a class of textDanger for the red color. Let me copy this and paste it for display order so we can monitor both of them. Once you save that, let me go back and refresh the page. Let me try to hit the create button. It hits our breakpoint and we get an error. Let me just stop the application. I get that from time to time, even though I did not edit anything while the project was running. So let me restart the application, and this time we should see the error messages. So let's hit the create button, and great. You can see it displays a default message. The name field is required and the value empty is invalid. So with that, you can see how easy it was to display validations from server side. Now the way you can tell this is server side is if you examine the tab here, every time we hit the button, it reloads. So it goes to the server and then it finds out that something is invalid, it returns back, and it displays the error message. With that, let's continue in the next video. These are the default validations that we have at the model level. But what if we want a custom validation? Let's say we want a validation that the name and display order cannot be same. How can we implement that custom validation and display that message right here? So let me close the application and we will have to implement that validation at the server side. And we can say if category.name is equal to category.displayOrder, we will have to convert that to a string. If these are the same, then we want to add an error message. So to manually add an error, we can access the model state, and in there we have a method addModelError. Now this method requires two parameters. First is a key name, and next is the error message. So you can name this key anything that you want. You can even keep that string.empty because we don't want to put anything in the key. But if you are adding more than one model errors, then you cannot have string.empty for both of them because this is a key value. So you can use distinct key name and then the error message. Let me say the display order cannot exactly match the name. So now we have added a custom error right here in our model state. As soon as you add this, the model state, even if it was valid before this execution, will now no longer be valid. And I will show that. But where will this error be displayed? Because if you go to create.cshtml, we have the validation for individual properties that are displayed right here. But we have something where we can display the summary of all the validation. So let's say right here we want to do that, then that will be inside a div, and we have a tag helper ASP validation summary. We can keep that as all. In that case, it will display all the validation summary at the top as well as at the individual level. Let me save this and run the application. If you go to categories here and try to create an empty category, let me remove the debugger and continue. And great, you can see here we see the validation summary and same properties are displayed right here. Now this time let me enter test and a display order. I will actually add the debugging point again on post and let me hit the button. If you examine the model state right now, you will notice that it is valid. We will add a debugging point and let's continue. It seems like it went through, and of course it did because the name and display order were not the same. Let's keep them same again. Continue, continue again. It is adding the model state error. Let me add another debugging point. Hit continue. And if you examine this time, it is not valid because we added a custom model error based on our requirement. So if we remove all debugging point and hit continue, we see the custom error that display order cannot exactly match the name. So this is how you can add custom validations. Now I want to show you one more thing. You can see we have used the tag helper to display label. If we go back, we have the label for display order and name. It is using the exact same name as property. But what if we want to display something else? What if we want to display a space between display order? Because inside the error messages also, it displays the same format. To do that, we have lots of data annotations that are available to help things. Let me go back to category and stop the application. Here we have the required data annotation. Similarly, we have a data annotation which is display, and there we can provide a name of whatever we want it to display. So let's call it display space order. Once you do that, if you save and run the application, now wherever it has to display the name of the property, it will use this display attribute and whatever name we have given. So if you go to categories, create new category, you see the space between display order, and if you write same thing, you have that in the custom validations. And my bad, this will not change because we are adding the custom string. So if you want that, you can always change that here. I thought for a second it was retrieved from the property name, but that's not the case. But you can see we can change the display attribute to display label wherever it is being displayed. Next, we also have custom data annotations other than required display and key. If you go back to the Microsoft documentation, you can see all of the annotations that are available, and there's quite a few of them. We have one here that is range that checks if the specified number is between a range of values. If you scroll up, we have the min length, phone number, key attribute, that is the one that we used, and we should have a display as well. Let's see how we can use the range attribute. When we have the display order, let's say we want to make sure that display order should always be between 1 and 100. So here we can use the range attribute, and it expects two parameters. One is the minimum value and maximum will be 100. Along with that, if you want to specify what error message should be displayed if that condition is not true, you can customize that if you do not like the default message. So we will display our custom error message, and let's see this in action. If we try to hit the create button, we have the invalid, but if we enter, let's say 222, hit create, now we see our custom error message. So there are lots of data annotations that are available that you can check out on the documentation. But we saw the use of display as well as range data annotation. With that, let's continue from the next video.